We all know the story. We learned it in grade school with construction paper headdresses and classroom plays. Friendly pilgrims looking for religious freedom land in a new world. They struggle, but with the help of kind-hearted native people, they survive and gather for a harmonious feast. It's a foundational American myth, a story of peace and mutual respect. But what if I told you that this story is a carefully constructed fable, designed to hide a much darker and more complicated truth? The real story that began with that famous meal isn't one of friendship. It's a story of disease, betrayal, and the beginning of a genocide. In this video, we'll uncover the history you definitely weren't taught in school. To get the real story, we have to rewind, not just to 1620 when the Mayflower landed, but a few years before. The land the Pilgrims would call New England was not an empty wilderness. It was the thriving homeland of the Wampanoag people and other indigenous nations for over 12,000 years. They had complex societies, established trade routes, and their own traditions of agriculture, diplomacy, and giving thanks. But just before the Pilgrims arrived, a catastrophe struck. Between 1616 and 1619, European traders unknowingly unleashed a plague along the coast. This event, now called the Great Dying, was an apocalyptic nightmare. It wiped out an estimated 75 to 90% of the indigenous population in the region. Entire villages were silenced, leaving behind homes, fields, and the bones of the dead. The English separatists who arrived in 1620 didn't find a virgin land, they found a graveyard. They saw this mass death not as a tragedy, but as a sign from God clearing the way for them to take the land. This devastation is the crucial and often intentionally omitted prologue to the Thanksgiving story. The Wampanoag, led by their sachem or chief, Massasoit, were in a desperate situation. Their numbers were critically low, and they were threatened by their rivals, the Narragansett tribe, who had been largely spared by the epidemic. The Pilgrims who arrived on the Mayflower were also desperate. They were completely unprepared for the harsh New England winter. During that first brutal season, about half of the 102 passengers died from starvation, scurvy, and exposure. They were on the verge of complete collapse. In their desperation and before any formal contact, they resorted to theft. They robbed Wampanoag graves and stole caches of corn and beans just to survive. From the Wampanoag perspective, these newcomers were not pious families, but grave-robbing thieves who violated their sacred sites. This was no way to start a friendship. It was an invasion. When spring finally came, the surviving Pilgrims were weak. At this moment, the Wampanoag had a choice. They had watched the English die off and could have easily wiped out the few who remained. Instead, they chose a different path, not one born of simple kindness, but of political necessity. In March of 1621, Massasoit made a calculated decision. Facing threats from the Narragansett, he saw the English and their firearms as dangerous but potential allies. He sent a delegate to Squanto, also known as Squanto, to approach the settlers. Squanto, a member of the Patuxet tribe who had been kidnapped by an English captain and sold into slavery, had only recently returned home to find his entire village had been wiped out by the plague. He served as an interpreter. An alliance was formed, a mutual defense pact. The Wampanoag would help the English survive, and the English would use their guns to help the Wampanoag defend themselves. This wasn't some blossoming friendship. It was a tense diplomatic arrangement, born out of pure desperation on both sides. That famous feast in the autumn of 1621 wasn't a planned joint celebration. The Pilgrims were celebrating their first successful harvest by firing their muskets. Hearing the gunfire, Massasoit and 90 of his warriors showed up, likely believing the English were either under attack or preparing to launch one. Seeing it was a celebration, they were invited to stay. But there wasn't enough food for everyone. Massasoit sent his own men out and they returned with 5 deer. For 3 days, the two groups ate and engaged in diplomacy. It wasn't a Thanksgiving. It was a temporary truce. A political summit. The Wampanoag were not simply honored guests. They were a powerful military delegation sizing up their strange new allies. But this fragile peace, born of convenience, was never going to last. The English colonists' insatiable desire for land and their belief in a divine right to it would soon shatter any illusion of coexistence. The story doesn't end with a shared meal. In fact, the real story was just beginning. Just 16 years later, the true nature of English colonial ambition revealed itself in blood and fire. By 1637, thousands more English settlers had arrived, hungry for more land. Tensions with the powerful Pequot tribe in neighboring Connecticut boiled over. In May 1637, English soldiers, led by Captains John Mason and John Underhill, along with their indigenous allies, surrounded the main Pequot village at Mystic. Inside were not warriors but hundreds of women, children, and elders. What happened next was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The English set the village's wooden walls on fire, trapping everyone inside. As the village burned, the soldiers shot anyone who tried to escape the flames. In less than an hour, somewhere between 400 and 700 Pequot people were burned alive or shot to death. William Bradford, the governor of Plymouth Colony, called it a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire, but said the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they gave the praise thereof to God. The Massachusetts Bay Colony governor, John Winthrop, then declared an official day of Thanksgiving to celebrate the massacre. This wasn't the first or last time a Thanksgiving was declared to celebrate the murder of indigenous people. It was a war of extermination, what today we call an act of genocide. The remaining Pequot were hunted down and sold into slavery. The final, devastating chapter for the Wampanoag came in 1675 with the outbreak of what the English called King Philip's War. Massasoit's son, Metacom, whom the English mockingly called King Philip, had watched for decades as the colonists stole their land, imposed English laws, and destroyed indigenous sovereignty. The war was sparked when Plymouth colonists executed 3 of Metacom's senior men. It was the final straw. Metacom unified several tribes in a desperate last-ditch effort to drive the English out. The conflict that followed was proportionally the deadliest war in American history. The fighting was brutal, but the outcome was catastrophic for the native people. The war ended in 1676 with as much as 40% of the Wampanoag population killed. Metacom was hunted down and killed. His body was quartered and his head was impaled on a spike and displayed in Plymouth for over 20 years, a gruesome warning to any other tribe that dared to resist. Thousands of indigenous survivors, including Metacom's own wife and son, were sold into slavery in the West Indies. The war shattered the power of the indigenous peoples of New England, opening the floodgates for total colonial domination. So if the real history is one of disease, theft, and warfare, where did our feel-good story come from? That myth was mostly invented in the 19th century. As the United States was being torn apart by the Civil War and experiencing massive immigration, the country needed a unifying origin story. An old account of the 1621 feast was rediscovered and romanticized by magazine editor Sarah Josepha Hawley, who campaigned for years to make Thanksgiving a national holiday. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln, hoping to unite a fractured nation, officially declared Thanksgiving a national holiday. The story of a peaceful meal was the perfect propaganda. It painted the colonists as benevolent and erased the centuries of violence that followed. It allowed America to tell itself a story of an innocent origin, a peaceful sharing between cultures, not a violent conquest. It turned a history rooted in conflict into a harmless fairy tale. This is why for many Native Americans today, Thanksgiving is a national day of mourning. Since 1970, the United American Indians of New England and their allies have gathered on Coles Hill in Plymouth to honor their ancestors and speak the truth about the genocide of their people and the theft of their lands. It is a day of remembrance and resistance against the very myth that tries to erase them from their own history. Understanding this real history isn't about guilt or canceling a holiday. It's about honesty. It's about acknowledging that the nation's foundations are far more brutal and complex than the stories we were told. The Thanksgiving myth isn't harmless. It whitewashes history and perpetuates the erasure of indigenous people who are still here, still fighting for their land, sovereignty, and culture. So this year, as you gather with your loved ones, remember the real story. Take a moment to learn about the indigenous people whose land you live on. Read the words of Wampanoag and other Native authors. Acknowledge the National Day of Mourning. Because true gratitude requires acknowledging the whole truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. If you want to learn more about this history, check out the resources in the description. And if you found this video informative, please like, share, and subscribe for more hidden histories.